Princess Catherine has finally, definitively confirmed exactly what half of elite London has been nervously whispering about for months, and the highly specific, calculated way she did it has completely changed the entire global conversation around King Charles's fragile future. We are absolutely not talking about a messy, leaked text message or a blurry, out-of-context photo from some random tabloid account. This was a highly controlled, recorded private interview explicitly prepared for senior palace review, and it unequivocally confirmed that King Charles absolutely has a formal, highly detailed abdication plan already actively in motion. Not a vague hypothetical, not a dusty worst-case scenario folder locked in a basement, an actual living transition document complete with hard timelines, massive duty transfers, and absolutely everything required to end a reign. And that single, staggering admission has basically violently pulled the monarchy's absolute biggest fear completely out of the shadows and dropped it squarely on the mahogany table, directly in front of absolutely everyone. Before we dive deep into exactly what this massive revelation actually means for William, Catherine, and honestly the entire British institution, take a quick second to subscribe to my channel so you absolutely don't miss the next explosive update. It genuinely helps the channel, and honestly this massive story is actively moving fast enough that you urgently want to know exactly when things shift again. So here is exactly where the narrative gets incredibly weird and highly specific. Catherine absolutely didn't frame this explosive revelation as vague confusion or idle speculation. She was incredibly careful, highly measured, exactly the way she always is, but she was also intensely direct in a way that polished royal statements almost absolutely never are. She explicitly confirmed that Charles had secretly, proactively prepared a highly private abdication plan. And for absolutely anyone who doesn't spend their precious free time obsessively reading British constitutional law, abdication explicitly means a reigning monarch formally, legally, stepping away from the throne entirely, while still physically alive, and completely passing absolute authority directly to the next in line long before death. That is absolutely not a cozy retirement announcement. That is a massive, historic, full transfer of the heavy crown, and Catherine deliberately saying it out loud, even in a highly controlled private recording, completely changed the entire institutional timeline. Because suddenly, the massive future absolutely wasn't some distant, abstract concept that William would have to sadly deal with eventually. It was already physically in the room. It was already being actively, aggressively planned completely around him. And the specific way Charles apparently reacted to the shocking news tells you absolutely everything you need to know about exactly how incredibly heavy this crisis actually is. He absolutely didn't explode in rage. He didn't furiously demand an immediate public retraction or start frantically making calls to his PR team to spin the massive story. He simply listened quietly, slowly lowered his glasses, and sadly turned away. That is absolutely not the immediate, fiery reaction of an innocent man who just heard a massive lie. That is the devastated reaction of someone who finally got caught secretly carrying something incredibly heavy he foolishly thought he could control alone. The massive plan was desperately supposed to be a highly private burden, something quietly, stoically shaped by absolute duty, profound exhaustion, and this very real, terrifying fear that the fragile crown would massively suffer if his physical strength publicly faded. But Catherine's stark statement completely revealed that this absolutely wasn't just a frantic emergency reaction to a sudden bad health update. It was a massive, detailed transition document, a rigid written plan explicitly setting out exactly how massive royal duties, highly visible public appearances, and absolute constitutional authority could rapidly move directly toward William significantly sooner than absolutely anyone outside the tightest inner circle was ever supposed to know. And once that explosive reality was out there, absolute certainty became the absolute most dangerous thing in all of Britain, because massive certainty explicitly meant the panicked palace had been secretly, desperately sitting on this explosive truth, while aggressively pretending absolutely everything was perfectly normal to the public. William absolutely didn't interrupt any of this. He intimately knew exactly what Catherine was doing, and he deeply knew exactly why she was bravely doing it. but he also profoundly understood the massive, painful wound it would inevitably leave behind. Charles absolutely wasn't just exposed. He was violently forced entirely into the open, long before the fractured family had found any way to successfully survive it together. At Windsor Castle, where they had apparently recently held a highly private, tense family briefing explicitly about Charles's diminishing future role, William's urgent readiness, and Catherine's massive influence, a senior aide quickly removed exactly one specific folder directly from the table. Absolutely no announcement was made, absolutely no explanation was given, absolutely no one dared ask for it back. But that single, small, panicked act clearly tells you the public has absolutely only heard the very first, superficial layer of exactly what is actually going on behind closed doors. There is significantly more hidden in that room than absolutely anyone is ready to admit publicly. The heavy silence immediately after Catherine's massive revelation was significantly heavier than the revelation itself. Some people will undoubtedly call her fiercely loyal for bravely refusing to let William blindly inherit a massive hidden storm. Others will harshly call her incredibly reckless for speaking up long before the terrified palace had successfully sealed absolutely every public crack. And honestly, both things can technically be true at the exact same time. She was fiercely protecting her husband from being dangerously blindsided by a massive plan that was already being actively built completely around him without his consent, but she also brutally forced the entire fractured family to finally confront something massive they had been desperately, cowardly avoiding. And once those massive words left the quiet room, absolutely every face positioned around the heavy throne started clearly revealing exactly what each specific person had been desperately hiding. This massive revelation didn't merely land on unfeeling strangers. It landed heavily on a highly complex family already carrying deep old wounds, terrifying private fears, and bitter unfinished battles. Charles faced the crushing weight of public surrender. William faced the immense, terrifying burden of becoming king long before his grieving heart was truly ready. Catherine faced the incredibly dangerous, isolating role of truth-teller, and Camilla, standing incredibly closest to the massive throne, suddenly found herself terrified, wondering whether the entire future had already moved completely past her. That is the crucial point that absolutely doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Absolutely everyone understandably focuses entirely on Charles and William, but Camilla's highly precarious position changes completely, entirely the exact moment Charles actually steps back, and she intimately knows that terrifying reality significantly better than absolutely anyone. Charles desperately tried to stay perfectly steady through all of this, but the immense, agonizing effort clearly showed in absolutely every single long pause. He had painstakingly spent his entire, incredibly long life exhaustingly preparing for the heavy throne, and now the heavy throne was brutally asking him to actively prepare for leaving it. That is an incredibly specific, agonizing kind of pain, and it matters immensely because a formal abdication absolutely doesn't just neatly change exactly one person's shiny title. It violently shakes the entire, ancient order of strict duty, complex family dynamics, vital public trust, and rigid succession. If he stepped back entirely too soon, Britain would undeniably see massive weakness. If he stubbornly held on entirely too long, the fragile crown could look incredibly fragile in a significantly much more dangerous way. There is absolutely no clean, easy exit from this massive crisis. Absolutely no version exists where absolutely everyone feels good about the final outcome. William stood quietly outside his father's highly private room and simply didn't move a muscle. He absolutely wasn't afraid of actually becoming king. He's lived heavily with that exact, inevitable future since his early childhood. What completely froze him in that hallway was something significantly more human, the deep, agonizing fear that actively accepting massive power early explicitly meant painfully watching his father completely disappear inside the massive decision. That is a loving son's profound fear, absolutely not an ambitious prince's fear. And Catherine watched him hesitate painfully and deeply understood the profound pain resting behind his heavy silence. She had bravely broken her own silence through that explosive recorded interview, but now the massive cost of that truth stood quietly beside her in the shape of her grieving husband, violently torn between immense duty to the nation and profound love for his fading father. That is absolutely not a dry political problem. That is a messy, tragic family problem heavily wearing a crown. Camila quietly heard the explosive statement from an adjoining room, and her hand reportedly tightened aggressively around the back of a heavy chair. She didn't speak a single word at first. She just stood and listened as Catherine's massive words moved incredibly rapidly through the sprawling palace, significantly faster than absolutely any official, written order ever could. The Queen Consort intimately knew the massive message mattered immensely, because absolute control of the narrative often rapidly becomes absolute control of the future. For years, she had stoically stood beside Charles exactly as the public face of steadiness and survival. Now, another, vastly more popular woman's voice had decisively become the absolute voice people were eagerly waiting to hear. And that massive shift, that quiet, undeniable transfer of immense emotional authority, is probably significantly harder for Camila to accept than absolutely any formal title change ever could be. Catherine's name appeared prominently near the absolute center of a highly private, restricted list of transition roles, a vital document that specifically assigned exactly who would guide fragile public confidence if massive royal authority suddenly shifted completely toward William. That specific list mattered immensely because it definitively proved she was absolutely not merely comforting the stressed prince completely behind closed doors. She was being deliberately, structurally placed exactly as the vital emotional bridge between the fading reign ending and the massive reign preparing to urgently begin. Camila reportedly saw her own name placed significantly lower than expected, and the devastating change in her face came long before absolutely any angry words did. The entire room seemed to intuitively understand long before the family officially admitted it aloud. Charles was painfully carrying surrender. William was heavily carrying tomorrow. Catherine was bravely carrying the truth. Camila was silently carrying the absolute fear of being completely left behind, and as exactly each person individually absorbed the massive shock, exactly one burning question became utterly unbearable. What specific, private moment had actively pushed the king toward massive abdication planning in the very first place? That is exactly where the story gets even stranger and significantly more intense. Absolutely every major royal crisis has a highly specific moment people later desperately pretend was significantly smaller than it truly was for this highly dramatic family. It explicitly happened at a highly private Windsor dinner, when Charles slowly pushed away his plate, quietly asked the room to completely stop discussing trivial appearances, and bluntly said the massive monarchy absolutely could not survive another entire year of pretending. Catherine looked sharply at William. William looked intensely at his father, and Camila understood instantly, viscerally, that something absolutely irreversible had just begun. Charles completely didn't raise his voice, and that specific, deadly calm made the massive confession infinitely more frightening. The king quietly called it the Windsor Transition Dinner, a highly private, intense family meeting explicitly meant to settle massive public duties, immense travel pressure, and the crushing strain of desperately keeping the massive monarchy looking perfectly calm, while the terrified people inside it were absolutely anything but calm. A transition, in specific royal terms, means the highly planned, orchestrated movement of massive duties and immense influence from one specific reign directly toward the next, completely before the heavy crown formally changes hands. That massive detail matters immensely, because this was absolutely not only a tense dinner. It was the very first time Charles formally admitted he had actively asked senior aides to meticulously prepare massive abdication options, and absolutely everyone around him instantly understood that the massive future had just been violently pulled directly into the present. William went completely pale when his father quietly said that massive duty, entirely without the physical strength to execute it, could permanently damage the crown. He had certainly heard vague warnings before, but absolutely never exactly like this. Absolutely never, with Charles speaking vulnerably as a tired man, accurately measuring his own physical limits directly in front of his family. Catherine deeply felt the massive change in him long before absolutely anyone else did. She gently reached for his hand directly beneath the table, absolutely not to stop him from reacting, but to desperately remind him he absolutely wasn't facing the massive, terrifying moment alone. The heavy crown had absolutely always been his ultimate destiny. That specific night, it finally began to feel exactly like a terrifying, immediate summons. Camila forcefully challenged the sudden timing almost immediately. She aggressively insisted the fragile monarchy urgently needed firmness, absolutely not public surrender, and she wrapped her deep panic entirely in a cold, highly controlled voice. She intimately knew exactly why the tense dinner mattered immensely. If Charles stepped back completely, her own precarious place directly beside the throne would immediately change with him, and the massive influence she had painstakingly built through incredible patience and sheer survival could completely shrink at a single quick signature. Catherine clearly heard the deep, absolute fear vibrating beneath Camilla's words. But she also explicitly heard something significantly sharper: fierce resistance. Charles eventually revealed, through a highly documented private account later meticulously reviewed by senior aides, that top advisors had actually already drafted a highly specific, staged withdrawal plan. The king calmly explained that this massive plan explicitly included a significantly reduced schedule, meaning drastically fewer grueling public duties, a formal regency-style transfer, meaning William would instantly carry significantly more royal authority while Charles technically remained monarch, and eventually a highly formal, final abdication announcement, explicitly meaning the throne itself would completely pass long before death. William looked directly toward him, completely stunned that absolutely so much had already been actively shaped without him. Catherine then acutely noticed exactly one specific aide completely refusing to meet her eyes, and that small, guilty avoidance told her the absolute worst part of all. Massive pieces of the secret plan had been actively discussed long before the prince was ever fully briefed. That is the specific, horrifying detail that completely changes everything. William absolutely wasn't just being vaguely prepared for a distant future role. He was being actively, aggressively moved into position entirely without his full, explicit knowledge or consent. And Catherine acutely noticed that specific dinner completely changed the entire meaning of her prior silence. She had absolutely not stayed quiet simply because she was uncertain or timid. She had stayed quiet entirely because she was meticulously measuring exactly who had been fiercely protected and exactly who had been cynically used. That night explicitly explained absolutely everything that aggressively followed. It explicitly explained exactly why her later, explosive statement felt exactly like fierce loyalty to William, but also exactly like open, massive defiance to those ambitious courtiers still desperately trying to control the massive truth. Once Catherine fully understood, the massive plan had been secretly shaped entirely around the prince long before he was truly ready. She intimately knew the very next massive confrontation could absolutely not be avoided. The absolute most dangerous royal conversations are absolutely not loudly shouted. They always happen in incredibly low voices firmly behind closed doors, where exactly one single sentence can completely redraw the entire future. Catherine bravely entered the highly private room, deeply knowing Charles was absolutely still king, absolutely still his father, absolutely still the fragile man absolutely everyone protected. But she also deeply knew William had been completely left to heavily carry a massive decision made entirely around him, so she bravely asked exactly the massive question absolutely no one else dared to ask. Catherine absolutely did not soften the brutal truth. She had formally requested the highly private meeting immediately after learning that massive parts of the secret abdication timetable had already been quietly, officially prepared, and the massive discovery instantly changed her from a quiet observer to a fierce challenger. An abdication timetable legally means a highly planned, rigid schedule for exactly how and exactly when a monarch might step back, massively reduce state duties, and completely transfer absolute authority entirely toward the next heir. That matters immensely because time itself had violently become absolute power. Absolutely, whoever completely controlled the massive timetable completely controlled exactly how William would be prepared, exactly how Charles would be protected, and exactly how much of the unvarnished truth the British public would actually ever hear. William waited patiently outside the heavy door and completely refused to interrupt. He intimately knew Catherine was absolutely not entering that room to maliciously wound his father. She was entering exactly because deafening silence had officially started to feel exactly like total surrender. He deeply understood the fragile monarchy absolutely could not ask him to carry a massive crown built entirely on complete uncertainty, yet he also deeply knew the king was absolutely not only a monarch in massive crisis. Charles was his vulnerable father. That was the absolute cruelest part of the entire situation. Massive duty relentlessly demanded incredible strength from William, but deep love urgently demanded immense mercy for the fragile man resting behind the heavy throne. Catherine calmly told Charles that the massive monarchy absolutely could not ask William to blindly inherit massive confusion. Her voice reportedly broke exactly once, only exactly once, and then she quickly pulled it back with the immense force of someone entirely refusing to let raw emotion weaken the massive truth. The king leaned back heavily, deep hurt flashing visibly across his tired face entirely before stiff defense completely took over. He firmly told her abdication planning was absolutely not abandonment. It was fierce protection. Charles vehemently insisted he had personally ordered the massive planning entirely because a heavy crown absolutely must never, ever be seen stumbling weakly in public, and entirely because William fully deserved a highly prepared, smooth path, absolutely not a sudden, chaotic collapse. Catherine slowly placed exactly one heavily marked page directly on the polished table. The specific page came directly from a highly documented, secret transition file, meticulously reviewed in highly private palace circulation, and it explicitly showed massive future duties already firmly assigned to William long before he had given absolutely any full consent. A transition file explicitly means a highly detailed, written internal plan decisively deciding massive roles, huge appearances, and absolute authority entirely during a major royal shift. That matters immensely because it definitively proved the prince's massive future had been entirely arranged long before his grieving heart had caught up with the reality of it. Charles stared heavily at the page, then quietly admitted the panicked palace deeply feared massive public panic if the huge plan was explicitly explained entirely too early. The tension in the room significantly tightened entirely around that massive admission. Catherine deeply understood then that massive silence had absolutely not only protected Charles, it had completely protected the terrified palace from the massive consequences of its own intense fear. The king stood incredibly slowly, his immense pain now heavily mixed with a stern warning, and quietly said, "Massive power is absolutely never transferred cleanly." Catherine instantly heard the deeper meaning entirely beneath the quiet words. Someone else entirely was already aggressively fighting for absolute control, and entirely beyond that closed heavy door, another highly ambitious force inside the massive palace was aggressively calculating exactly what Charles's abdication would truly mean for rank, absolute influence, and sheer survival. A massive abdication is absolutely never only a simple personal decision. It is grinding machinery. It is precise timing, massive signatures, huge titles, major appearances, grand rooms reassigned, and powerful names moved significantly higher or lower on highly private, restricted lists. And directly in the middle of that massive grinding machinery stood actual, real people with visibly trembling hands and highly guarded faces. One ambitious courtier watched Charles weaken, one top advisor watched William steadily rise, and Camilla acutely watched Catherine become the absolute emotional center of the monarchy's entire next chapter. Charles deeply knew the terrified palace had completely moved from sheer fear into active, massive preparation. The tired king sat quietly before one massive internal approval note and held his pen significantly longer than necessary, exactly as if wet ink could somehow become permanent surrender. The palace transition team, meaning the incredibly small, elite group of senior officials actively planning exactly how massive duties and highly public messages would rapidly shift during a royal change, had already begun aggressively reviewing hundreds of patronages, massive state appearances, grueling travel schedules, and important speeches. Patronages are the numerous charities and highly public causes officially supported by a specific royal figure, and they matter immensely because officially moving them directly from one person to another clearly shows exactly where absolute influence is truly going. If those massive duties shifted entirely too quickly, the entire public would instantly know the heavy crown was already actively changing hands. William's busy office received massively expanded authority incredibly quietly, but the utter quiet precisely made it significantly more powerful. The prince was absolutely no longer just being vaguely prepared for a distant, abstract future. He was actively being given the absolute tools of direct command completely before the heavy crown had formally reached him. That matters immensely because absolute authority inside the massive monarchy does absolutely not always arrive cleanly with a massive, glittering ceremony. Sometimes it arrives silently through heavy calendars, classified briefings, and the absolute right to explicitly approve massive words entirely before the nation actually hears them. Catherine's massive role became exactly as important because the princess was now widely seen as the absolute only person who could successfully make massive transition feel exactly like total stability instead of chaotic collapse. Camila sat entirely alone after the massive planning session and slowly removed her reading glasses. She had intensely watched Catherine's name repeatedly appear at the absolute center of a highly private, massive control chart, a chart that explicitly mapped exactly who would confidently lead public-facing moments during Charles's gradual, sad step back. That specific chart mattered immensely because it absolutely did not merely list boring tasks. It heavily revealed absolute trust. Catherine was explicitly placed exactly where absolute calm, national unity, and immense public confidence absolutely had to be strongest. Camilla clearly saw it, deeply understood it, and instantly felt the ground violently shift entirely beneath her. The queen consort had spent long years fiercely fighting to be accepted directly beside the king, but now, another, significantly more popular woman's steadiness was actively becoming the monarchy's ultimate shield. Charles finally signed the heavy note at last and paused deeply before slowly handing it over. The king clearly seemed to deeply understand that exactly one signature could heavily protect the massive crown, while simultaneously cutting deeply into his own profound sense of personal purpose. An aide explicitly warned in a highly documented briefing summary that if Camilla actively resisted the massive plan publicly or even privately, the massive palace would aggressively move entirely without her approval. That specific warning carried a brutal, unmistakable message. Absolute rank could absolutely no longer stop massive momentum. The massive machinery had officially begun to breathe completely on its own. William gained massive room. Catherine gained absolute trust. Charles sadly lost massive pieces of direct command. Camilla completely lost absolute certainty. The massive plan was absolutely no longer hidden entirely inside sealed folders. It was actively beginning to dramatically change massive rooms, heavy schedules, familiar faces, and old loyalties. The very first clear sign of massive fallout was absolutely not a screaming headline. It was a heavy door closing loudly. A senior aide left Charles's office carrying a massively revised schedule, and within mere minutes, the entire rhythm of the massive palace drastically changed. Important calls were suddenly delayed. Sensitive briefings were frantically rewritten. Camilla's panicked team aggressively demanded immediate answers. William stayed completely silent significantly longer than anyone expected, and Catherine, having bravely spoken the unvarnished truth, now had to agonizingly watch the truth deeply wound absolutely everyone around her. Charles deeply understood the massive schedule had essentially become a public confession. The king's upcoming, highly public duties were quietly, massively reduced, and William was explicitly placed forward in several highly symbolic, massive appearances. The specific kind of appearances that clearly told the entire nation exactly who was becoming absolutely harder to ignore. Massive public duties mean highly official royal work, such as major ceremonies, important state visits, and massive national events. And they matter immensely because the observing public explicitly reads highly visible presence exactly as massive strength. If Charles completely vanished entirely too often, people would undeniably see massive weakness. If William abruptly appeared entirely too often, people would undeniably see a massive transfer already aggressively beginning. The terrified palace desperately tried to soften the massive change with highly careful, focus-grouped wording. But Catherine's explosive recorded private interview had already forcefully forced the absolute truth completely beyond thick family walls.